Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Do you remember when you first read Shakespeare? It's okay if you've never read Shakespeare, by the way. But if you have, do you remember when that first came up? For me, it was ninth grade. We did 3 plays, I believe. Yeah, we did Hamlet, and then we watched the Mel Gibson movie that had just come out. We did Macbeth and watched some really old cheeseball, like 60s production of that. And then we watched Julius Caesar, and we chased that by going down to Denver and watching a Theater in the Round presentation of that. That made a big impression on me. And I remember in Julius Caesar, when the part came up where Julius Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, has the dream and comes to him and is like, I had a dream. Ides of March, you got to look out for that. Don't go out. Don't go to the Senate. Don't do that. I remember at that point being like, whoa, that reminds me a lot of stuff that I heard in church about the whole Jesus and Pontius Pilate and Pontius Pilate's wife thing. I wonder if there's a connection there. Well, guess what? I still wonder if there's a connection there. To be clear, the whole sequence where Calpurnia has the dream about Caesar and warns him about the Ides of March, that is not a Shakespearean invention. That goes all the way back. Like all of the big name historians from the 1st century BC, AD, 2nd century AD, they all write about that. Suetonius, Plutarch, Cassius Dio, all these guys tell the story of the closest character in Roman history to being a messianic character getting this warning from his wife. Now, Calpurnia was Caesar's like 3rd or 4th wife. She was way, way, way younger than Caesar, but was held out as being really virtuous and faithful and loving wife, even though Julius Caesar probably wasn't a super faithful and loving husband. And generally, those historians do paint a picture that this influential character in the Roman hierarchy was getting some kind of guidance from beyond, and that Caesar, a very idealized character, would have been advised to have listened to her. So what do we make then of how the original audience might have responded to this little detail that is only included in the book of Matthew about Pontius Pilate's wife having a dream that she warns him about involving Jesus and crucifying him? Because, it overlaps, right? Ninth grade me isn't crazy. You can see it here. Let me read it to you. You've heard it before. You're going to hear it again right here. All right. So there's a bunch of stuff. Jesus and the disciples, they have a last supper. Jesus is like, I'm going to get betrayed. And they go to the garden praying about stuff. Everybody falls asleep. Judas shows up and Jesus is like, that's the guy. And they're like, cool, that's good enough. And Jesus is like, no, I'm going to kiss him. And they're like, no, really? Jesus' point, it's fine. We know who you mean. He's like, I'm going to kiss him. It makes it better. Let me kiss him. And it's like, okay, fine. And then Judas kisses Jesus, and Jesus is like, hey, we're not going to use swords on people. I'm not leading a rebellion. And then they take Jesus off and they arrest him, and he goes and he gets tried before Caiaphas in a sneaky middle of the night trial. And sure enough, he's found guilty, in part because he says, yes, it is as you say, to the question, are you the Son of God? But then the high priests, the religious leaders who don't have the power to execute Jesus, trot him over to Pilate. Some stuff happens in there with Peter screwing things up, and with Judas, his fate is sealed and that story arc is finished. And then we're in front of Pilate, and Pilate's like, okay, what are we doing? We're at a trial or something. I hadn't heard about any recent rebellions. What's going on? And so he listens and he's like, I'm not seeing it at all. I don't understand why you guys are mad about it. And they're like, well, he says he's the king of the Jews. And Pilate's like, okay, well, hang on, let me ask. Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus is like, yep, it's as you say. And Pilate's like, okay, but I'm still sizing you up, and you don't have any metaphorical F-15s. I don't think you're much of a real threat. And so he's like, I don't know. I don't really see it. I think we probably just better let him go. And then all the religious leaders are like, no, we wouldn't want that. We definitely wouldn't want that. And then it's like, oh, yeah, we got this thing that we do around the Passover every year where we let one person go. And Pilate's like, so it probably should be this Jesus guy because he seems harmless enough. Let's just go with that. And everybody's like, nah, let's do Barabbas. And Pilate's like, he had an insurrection, remember? Like murdered people. What? Seems like Pilate wants to go with this Jesus fellow, but the religious leaders stoke up the crowd, and the crowd's like, no, we want Barabbas freed. We want Jesus crucified. And eventually Pilate's like, all right, fine. I wash my hands of all of this stuff. His blood be on your hands. And they're like, great. His blood be on our hands and on our children's. And I just made a little video about that particular verse and some of the ways that people read it. It's a YouTube short. I just put that out today. If you go and check that out, you're going to get a quick little 60-second preview of where we're headed in future conversations here. But in the middle of all of that, while Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, so he's like in front of people here, his wife sent him this message. Maybe it came in real sneaky like. We don't get an account of this in any of the other Gospels. Maybe it was a little note or something. Maybe she went and stood in the back and made like little gestures, and he's trying to act like he's paying attention, but he's squinting at his wife, who's like making crucified gestures, and then like don't do it, like kind of the throat, knock it off kind of gesture with the flat hand. I don't know, one way or another, he gets the message. It looks like it's more specific than what you can do with charades, because it says, don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I've suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him. Obvious question. How did Matthew know that? Well, I suppose somebody might have told him when he was doing homework about it. I suppose maybe Pilate even repeated it to some people, and the truth of that detail circulated because Pilate really wanted to distance himself from it and protect his wife as well. He was like, we both didn't feel great about it. Maybe Pilate was incentivized to let people know. Heck, maybe somebody got their mitts on the note and Matthew got a look at that thing. I have no idea, because we don't get to see all of the behind the scenes stuff here in terms of Matthew's research. But he says that's what the note communicated, and it seems to be in keeping with the general sense of unease that is happening in Pilate's mind, in Pilate's palace, in Pilate's governorship, and indeed even in Pilate's own marriage. But at any rate, as he's getting this message, the chief priests and the crowds are yelling how much they want Barabbas and everything else. And then we get the whole hand-washing business that I told you about there a minute ago. So now look, there are some people who are like, well, Matthew was written way, 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 way later. Now, by way, way, way later, there's only so far we can really push it back, because we start to get bits of Matthew that appear in manuscript fragments in the 2nd century. So, I mean, it can't be written in like 500 AD. And the fact that we have any bits or fragments means that it had been in serious circulation to have stood the test of time as a copy long before our first round of fragments. So it takes a pretty aggressive push at this point in history to suggest that Matthew was written well into the 2nd century. I'm with the church fathers who say, like, we've had Matthew, we've been reading Matthew, it's been around for quite a while. They're saying this in the early and middle 2nd century. They're like, no, this is written by Matthew. One guy even says it was written in the language of the Hebrew people, so it looks like he understood it was written to the Hebrew people. And like I said way back at the very beginning, I think Matthew was written somewhere in the middle to the middle second half of the 1st century, a few decades after the time of Jesus. And I think Matthew began to be composed probably even during the life of Jesus. I think Matthew's a meticulous guy. I think he's taken notes. I think he's gathering these little details along the way. But the point is, whether you agree with me on the early date of Matthew or a much later date, either way, still everybody in that original audience would have heard the stuff about Julius Caesar, right? He's one of those guys who everybody in the entire empire knew about. Everybody knew that name. And probably a pretty large percentage had heard the legend of his assassination and the events of the premonition of his wife, Calpurnia, leading up to that assassination. Is Matthew maybe trying to seize on the contemporary assumptions of the common person during that day who would say, no, I really think that was a message from beyond, where God or the gods were trying to protect their chosen agent, Julius Caesar? And maybe Matthew is trying to very intentionally juxtapose that here. So in the minds of people, they'll be like, well, what would the God from beyond be trying to accomplish by sending this message to Pilate's wife? Should we think of this the same way we think about the premonition that was given to Julius Caesar, or is this in contrast to the premonition that was given to Julius Caesar? I've got mountains of contemporary evidence in the 1st century to say that the Julius Caesar story was big time spread around. People knew it, people read it. So I'm ready to go to the mat to say a whole lot of Matthew's original audience would have immediately had that come to mind, the same way it came to mind for me in 9th grade. What I think we need to wrestle through more tomorrow is, who is Pilate's wife? What do we know about her? And why is this anecdote in here? What was the original audience, who would have been very familiar with the Caesar story, to have made of this? And what are we as a later audience, who might not remember those details about the story, to make of it now? Final thought. I went and read some of the really nice reviews that you all left on your various podcast apps. I saw that someone left a review that simply said, pork chop sandwiches, in regard to some ridiculous internet G.I. Joe meme that I talked about once. It's really funny because there are tons of inside jokes like that you all are shooting at me in the reviews that you're leaving on the interwebs, and I am charmed to death by it. That is super, super kind of you. Some of you are just going right through the front door and saying things that you suspect would be encouraging to me. You suspect right. I've read every word of every review you've ever left, and it's super encouraging to hear from you. This is a very one-way medium. It's just the nature of podcasting and what it is. And so that's one of the few places where I get to hear back a little bit, and it really means a lot. And it also is the kind of thing that very much helps other people get connected with the podcast here. So thank you to everyone who has written one of those on one or more platforms. I know a lot of you have written reviews on like 4 or 5 different podcast platforms because I see the same screen name popping up. That is awesome. And as always, I'm not ashamed to ask if you'd be willing to write a review, any of you. I would super, super welcome that. It is a gigantic help personally and in terms of the well-being of the podcast as well. Y'all are awesome. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon. What will you find?